Hello and welcome to this second webcast recording for the Uriah Road Corridor project. In this video, we will discuss the design concepts as currently developed. But first, a brief recap from the first video. In the first video, we discussed the who, what, where, when, why, and how of the corridor, and how these simple questions can inform a foundational understanding of elements like human scale, the roadway's experience, the roadway's deficiencies, and how all of these elements can inform both the growth and the planning efforts along the corridor into the future. Our study has also been organized into two phases, Phase 1 and Phase 2. Phase 1 is from the John Warner Parkway headed north toward the Rio 29 Small Area Plan, and Phase 2 is the John Warner Parkway headed south toward the city's jurisdictional boundary. For the purposes of today's presentation, we will be focused on Phase 1 only. Within Phase 1, we will discuss intersection design elements at primary intersections, including Hillsdale, Belvedere, and John Warner, and we will also discuss the corridor design in between these intersections. Again, we need the entire corridor to act as a unified whole corridor, while at the same time, the design improvements at each area of the intersection need to reflect the deficiencies and observations at each of these discrete areas. So we will start by looking at the intersection design elements. So the first intersection we will look at together is the John Warner intersection. At this intersection, we've observed that there is redundant infrastructure in place. And by redundant infrastructure, we mean there are additional roads and additional intersections that really don't make the experience any better, and in fact, they make it worse. We've also noted that there is underutilized public space. The green space in the middle of all of this redundant infrastructure is hard to get to, and it's not really providing much of a public benefit at this time. The third observation is that because this redundant infrastructure is present, it's also not spaced appropriately. That poor spacing is what we call an access management violation. We discussed that in video 1. And this poor access management is really what contributes to number 4, the poor level of service at this primary intersection. And so when taken together, we have a poor performing intersection with additional redundant infrastructure and non-compliant spacing that leads to underutilized public space. So certainly there seems like there's room for improvement. One other thing to note, and this is again a brief recap from the first video, that safety is also a concern at this intersection. Between 2013 and 2020, there was almost 40 accidents at this intersection. That's several accidents per year, and we think that that can also be improved based on removing the redundant infrastructure and the access management challenges. So what are we looking for? Well, we're looking for creating a simpler intersection. Again, removing redundancy, creating simplicity. And really that is reducing this to a crossroads. We see two roads that need to intersect, and that's, two axes, one heading north-south, one heading east-west, at a very simple level. The other thing we're looking to do is to remove the redundancy, and I think you can remove the redundancy by pursuing simplicity. The other thing we want to do is we want to use what we have. And well, what do we have? We have smart scale funding dollars on the table that are provided for a roundabout. And so we don't want to lose that money. We want the solution that we're proposing to be of the same intent of what was funded. And so we're going to be proposing a roundabout. The question is, where should that roundabout go? And if you look at this diagram, you would think that the roundabout is more or less centered at the crossroads. And that's what we see here. We are actually showing that the roundabout should be offset from the current intersection location by several hundred feet. And so how do they compare when overlaid? You can see that the original conceived John Warner improvement concept, which was a roundabout, was located centered on the original intersection, which did nothing to remove additional redundancy. It did nothing to increase access to public spaces. In fact, even this proposed solution could not operate at its highest capacity because of these conflicts. So we're proposing to shift that roundabout to the north, and in doing so, we have the opportunity to gain back public space for the park. We have removed the redundancies, and we have simplified the intersection geometry. And I think the biggest win from this is not just the operational capacity of the intersection, but how we've been able to aggregate public space, not just the public space that exists, but we're able to aggregate that with the public space that is being proffered as a result of the Wetzel property development. And this results in, I think, a true public benefit for that area. So what does that look like? Well, here's an initial visualization of that area. We can see that there's a roundabout in the left side of the image, and in the center of the image is really that gained back public space. You can see this looks very different. One of the most noteworthy differences is that primary intersection to K-Tech has been removed. Now, in conversations with K-Tech, we're learning that there needs to be some sort of access there, but it will probably be look different than what's currently there. So we're still working with that landowner, and that will be included on future updates about the project. Here's another look at this. Again, the roundabout toward the center of the image. The camera position here is more or less over Belvedere, looking back toward the east and south. And finally, one more image similar to the first, showing a simplified geometry, public space, and really a much simplified and preferred option to the roundabout that's currently been funded by VDOT. Next, let's have a look at the Belvedere intersection. At this intersection, we observe that, and we know that there are substantial delays at this intersection. And those delays happen mostly during the peak hour, but not only is it a delayed turning movement, but it's also a very unsafe turning movement because vehicles wanting to turn left from Belvedere to go south on Rio or John Warner have to cross several lanes of traffic in both directions. And that is really a complex turn to make, especially at the peak hour. And that results in some crashes, which we'll talk about in just a moment. There's also a commercial entrance more or less in the intersection, and that also contributes to problematic aspects of the operational capacity of this intersection. So we'll be working specifically with City Church on an agreeable solution that allows them to maintain good access while hopefully moving that commercial entrance out of the effective area of the intersection. Again, between 2013 and 2020, there was almost 20 crashes at this intersection, again indicating that safety is of a concern and that whatever we propose needs to promote additional safety benefits to the intersection. So what are we proposing? Well, we're proposing what's called a green T intersection, and what this does is it minimizes the conflict points that a vehicle might have. And by conflict point, we mean really the point that an accident could happen. And so by introducing this green T intersection, we're allowing what could be a vehicle crossing maneuver to become a vehicle merging maneuver, which is a much safer maneuver for vehicles and should reduce a lot of the accidents that we're seeing at this intersection. We're also looking to consolidate entrances with K-Tech and City Church with some sort of frontage road design. Again, that is still in communication and coordination with these landowners, and we will report more on that in future videos. So some initial visualizations of what this might look like. The Belvedere intersection is there about at the third point to the right of the image, and K-Tech and City Church are across the street. You can see the introduced median and green T. Here's a close-up of that. Again, Belvedere to image right, and that is a close-up image of a green T intersection. And finally, looking back the other way, this is now looking back toward the John Warner intersection. Again, simplified geometry, partial access median, which is basically that green T. All right, let's have a look at the Hillsdale intersection. This is a very complex intersection, not because it's just one, but because it's multiple intersections that are so close to each other they might as well be one intersection. Also of note is that the lanes on Rio Road are at their narrowest here. They are very narrow, and so you have not only intersections close together, but the lanes are very tightly packed in. It is the topographic high point of the corridor, which I think is of interest, especially as we consider proposed improvements. Pedestrian crossings in this area are sort of confusing. It's not all directions at all times. You kind of have to weave your way through the intersections if you are a pedestrian. Again, access management. I'm calling it an access management nightmare. These intersections are so close that neither of them can operate effectively. There are many accidents here, substantial delays. There are utilities overhead in the area, and the intersection is surrounded by private property. So all of these elements taken together lead to a complex challenge. Returning to accidents, you can see here that at these intersections we have almost over 60 accidents happening between 2013 and 2020. This is more than any other intersection or intersections on the corridor, so this is certainly of safety concern. Again, returning to access management, these intersections are so close to each other. They are about 20% of the spacing that would be required by VDOT. So we're seeing about 80% of the spacing criteria that should be separating these intersections is not there. And that results in just all of the experiences that we know about, just delays, crashes, confusion, and just poor operational capacity. So what can we do about this? Well, I think we need to get the intersections acting as one. So the two need to become one, sort of like a marriage. We need to slow the cars down. We need to create predictable pedestrian infrastructure so that pedestrian crossings are not just easy, but they're predictable to vehicles. And I think we should try to leverage this topographic high point for some sort of gateway type feature to the corridor that can also serve as a traffic calming device. And so what that looks like in plan is a roundabout of sorts, but it's a peanut shaped roundabout. It's bean shaped. It's not singular. It's dual, but it functions singularly. And here's what that might look like in a visualization rendered form. You can see that the intersection is not much bigger than it is currently, and yet the space is much more appropriately utilized for all those challenges that we mentioned. Here's another image of the intersection. You can see the pedestrian crossings are highlighted and clear, and there's refuge islands at each one. There's a good image of a refuge island. And here is a final image of that intersection from more of an aerial perspective. Again, highlighting that pedestrian crossings are very clear. The pedestrian zone is very well defined. There is a gateway type feature to this high point on the corridor, and that the interaction between vehicles and pedestrians should be predictable and safe. So let's now turn our attention to the corridor design itself. This would be the areas along the roadway that exist between the intersections, but need to work in concert with the intersections for a high-functioning corridor. First, let's talk about what are the elements that make a corridor. And when we talk about the elements of a corridor, what we mean are the parts of the roadway that can be defined, whether it's a sidewalk or a travel lane for a vehicle or a bike lane, a raised median, shared use paths. All of these elements create the typical section of the roadway. And so we need to determine what we need and where to put it. So 2 questions to start us off. How much space do we have to work with? And what are we going to put into that space? So the first answer is the space we have to work with along the corridor is variable. This is what we refer to as the right-of-way. This is the public realm. This is public space. This is not land owned by any private entity. This is owned by the government. This is Albemarle County and VDOT's land. It's your land. And so the right-of-way is the space that we have to work with for the most part. Along this corridor, the right-of-way changes in width all over the place. It generally seems like the right-of-way is between 80 and 90 feet wide. Another way to look at this is, what is the average width of current public infrastructure? So we're talking from sidewalk to sidewalk. And that width is about 84 feet. And that's going to become our goal to work with. We're going to try to make sure that we're working within a width of about 84 feet. That way, we're not proposing improvements that need to require a lot of additional right-of-way acquisition. So what do we need in this corridor space? Well, one of the project goals is to create a shared use path that will establish the Northtown Trail connection. This would basically create a trail along the roadway similar to the John Warner Parkway and the Berkmar Drive extension project that has a asphalt path for pedestrians and bicyclists along the road. And if we can create this connection along Rio, we've done a great service to the community in creating this non-motorized transit opportunity. We think that by introducing buffered spaces between the roadway and the sidewalk will be of a benefit to pedestrians and cyclists alike. We're going to need to continue to accommodate 4 vehicular lanes of travel. For nearly 30,000 vehicles per day, we're not going to get away with reducing the number of lanes, so we still need 4 lanes. And again, we want to be able to continue to accommodate bicyclists and cyclists along the corridor. So if we look at this current section as presented here, we see a shared use path on one side of about 10 feet in width, a buffer space of 6 feet, curb and gutter adjacent to the roadway corridor, travel lanes, a median, and again, travel lanes in the other direction, and a sidewalk and buffer strips on the other side. So all in, we're talking approximately 85 feet in width. And that puts us very close to that 84-foot number that we were hoping for. So there may be a bit of flexing on some of these space requirements, but at least we're proposing a width of a program that's about comparable to what we see currently. Now, I think the biggest change is that we've reallocated the bike space to not in the road, but along the shared use path. That's where we really gained the space for the buffer spaces and the shared use path. So looked at in a visualized form, here would be a portion of Rio Road that has, starting on the left side, a sidewalk, a buffer strip for tree plantings or vegetated plantings, 2 travel lanes, a raised median, 2 more travel lanes, another buffer strip, and a shared use path. And that reflects, again, approximately 85 feet in width, which is more or less using what we have to work with. It's a very close comparable. So this is what the proposed corridor typical section of Rio Road could be. Again, continuing with some more visualizations, here shows the Rio Road corridor typical section played out near Wakefield. And what you see there in the center of the screen is actually an R-cut, which provides an opportunity for vehicles to make a U-turn at various places along the corridor. That R-cut space is needed because we're introducing a raised median the whole way, and so we're taking away the full access that's currently observed along the corridor and putting a raised median in its place. And therefore, in certain locations along the corridor, we need to provide space for vehicles to make a U-turn. Here's yet another visualization of that typical section, and this is near Gasoline Alley. This is what it might look like down near Gasoline Alley. And here's yet another one. This is near the Old Stone Chapel of, I think, Christ Community Church near Huntington. And one final typical section image. You can see here we have a mid-block crossing proposed as well. And that's the benefit of having raised medians, is that pedestrians who want to cross the corridor can do so at more regular intervals and they have a place of refuge in between each direction of travel flow. I'm sure you're aware that pedestrian accommodations along the corridor currently are very sparse, and crossing the corridor currently is near impossible unless you are at Greenbrier Drive, which has only recently been upgraded to include a pedestrian crossing signal at that intersection. So that is a brief introduction to some of the design concepts of both intersections and corridor design elements. We share these with you so that you can take it in, look at the images, and come back with your comments and your thoughts at the next CAC meeting in September. So again, if you're watching this video, you've probably already found the website, but we look forward to hearing your informed feedback at the September 23rd CAC meeting. Thank you for joining these virtual webcasts. We'll look forward to developing some more for phase 2 and refined concepts in the future. We look forward to hearing your thoughts on these concepts, and we look forward to continuing to refine this corridor plan based on your feedback. So please stay tuned in, and we'll talk to you again soon.